Hi, good evening or good morning, depending on where you're signing in from to this webinar that we are hosting at ITDP on transport justice, designing fair transport systems. I hope everyone can hear me. This is Michael Kodransky, and this webinar is part of ITDP's Leadership and Innovation Program and is part of a series of activities that we have planned that is leading up to our Mobilize Summit, which will take place in Santiago, Chile on June 28th to 30th in 2017. And the theme of that summit is just and inclusive cities. So as we prepare for the summit, we are unpackaging what does it mean to plan with justice and inclusiveness in mind. And so today we have Karel Martens from Technion in Israel and also Radboud University in the Netherlands. And he will talk to us about a methodology that he has come up with and based on philosophical principles that he has researched. And so with that, I will turn over the webinar to Karel, and at the end we will have a chance for a Q&A. If you look on your screens, there is a Q&A button. So as questions arise, if you can write in your questions and it'll queue everyone's questions up, and then we'll select them in the second portion of the webinar. So I turn over to Karel.
Thank you, Michael, and good day to all around the world. I'm very happy to share my thoughts with you on transport and justice. It's a theme I've been working on for almost 10 years now, partly philosophy, partly for practical, getting to how to do transportation planning. And I would like to share some of the ideas that I've developed in my book with you. And I think some of the ideas that I will present are in a way very obvious, but at the same time very radical. So I would love to hear your questions and responses to see whether the fact that some things are obvious also makes them more feasible, perhaps. Now I want to start this webinar with two starting points for my work. And the first one is a broadly held belief about social justice. Now this opinion about social justice, which I think is shared by many people around the world in many places, is beautifully captured by a quote by the philosopher Charles Taylor. And the quote reads as follows: "Our modern conceptions of practical reason are shaped, I might say distorted," Charles Taylor writes, "by the weight of moral skepticism. By this, I am thinking of the widespread belief that moral positions cannot be argued, that moral difference cannot be arbitrated by reason, that when it comes to moral values, ultimately we all just have to jump for the ones we feel best to us." So what Charles Taylor says here is most people feel that social justice is an opinion, it's something you maybe express when you're voting, it's something like taste when you're eating, and it's not open for reasoning. Charles Taylor doesn't agree with this perspective. He believes that this perspective is flawed. He argues in his work that systematic reasoning can actually play a role in arbitrating moral difference, that social justice is more than an opinion. He argues that not every position can be defended based on rational grounds, that some arguments are really better than others, and that some positions can be defended whilst others cannot. Now, I think this is an important understanding, not that reason and so social justice can actually give a final answer, but that we can argue systematically about social justice. And I think it's one of the important roles of academics to do so, to contribute to systematic reasoning about social justice, and so they can feed societal debates. And I immediately admit that academic reasoning, systematic reasoning cannot give a final answer. Certainly not. There is no one single right answer about what is fair or just. But we can feed societal debates about what is fair or just. And in my work, it has been my ambition to develop such a systematic argumentation for the field of transportation, to systematically argue what might be justice in transportation. That's my first starting point. We can systematically reason about social justice, and we should. Now, my second starting point consists of a comparison between transport and other important domains of government intervention, and I especially think here about housing, healthcare, and education. And if I compare these fields to transport, I see two important differences. So first, in housing, health, and education, I see that debates about the role of government virtue always circle around arguments of fairness and justice. If you take the arguments exchanged in the parliaments around the world, you will see that considerations of justice are quite central in the debates. And in contrast, if you would compare the analysis and the arguments in transport, you will see that they always center around the notion of efficiency. It is not that fairness is never raised, but the position of fairness in these societal debates is marginal at best. The second difference between transport and housing, health and education, is that in these three domains there's actually a very rich academic literature about social justice. And those debates feed practice, and practitioners actually draw on these academic works, and they draw on the conclusions of those academic works, like a right to housing is in the end an end of a systematic argumentation why housing is important for people. And so people draw systematically on these arguments. In contrast, in transport, we don't have much systematic reasoning about justice, and so we cannot draw on these arguments. Now, a key message of my book is that transport is just as important for people as healthcare, education, and housing. And so we should, and we have to, address justice when we are debating interventions in transport systems. Justice should be an integral part of our thinking about the design of transport systems. We cannot merely design our systems based on the principle of efficiency. Justice has to be part of the debate. Now, a key aim of my book has therefore been to define what is justice in transport. Now, there's multiple dimensions to this question, and certainly one of them includes participation in decision making. There are fundamental questions there about who is supposed to be involved, how are people to be involved, and how are decisions to be made. There's also issues about environmental externalities, air pollution, noise pollution, road safety, that include justice issues. I do not focus on any of these issues in my book, although they are very important. But I start from the fundamental role that transport systems play in people's lives. And I say nothing new if I say that transport is a means to an end. Transport systems enable us to get to places. If you want to pay a visit to the doctor, to get to work, to go to education, or simply to meet family or friends. Transport systems are the only means to connect us physically to all these places and destinations. There is no alternative. And because there is no alternative to movement, the design of transportation systems should focus first and foremost on that role of transportation systems in people's lives. In other words, we should focus our design and redesign of transportation systems on accessibility. Now, to avoid confusion with accessibility, I do not mean how easy people can get to their current job or to their current school or to the doctor they want to visit today. Accessibility is the ease with which people can access a multitude of destinations, multiple activities, even if they do not want to travel there at the moment. Accessibility in this sense is very important for people, I think, because it captures in a fundamental way important notions like freedom and choice. Now, in a way, this way of looking at accessibility is nothing new, and it has been around for at least 2 decades in transportation debate, I think. And indeed, it's nothing new to say that we should move away from focusing on mobility and on ease of movement to focus on accessibility. So that's not my contribution. My contribution is somewhere else. What has not been addressed in any systematic way is how we should distribute accessibility. And it's very clear that we cannot have the same level of accessibility for every person. Accessibility is higher in cities than in rural areas, higher in the city center than on the urban fringe. So clearly accessibility cannot distribute equally. And so the question is, how should we distribute it? Should transport planners simply try to maximize average accessibility across the population? Or should there be another principle to guide the distribution of accessibility? That, for me, is the key question of justice in transportation. What patterns of accessibility are acceptable? Now, in order to answer that question, I have drawn on Ronald Dworkin's philosophy of justice. Like many theories of social justice, Ronald Dworkin's theory is, in its essence, a thought experiment. And what I have done in my book is basically to transpose his thought experiment to the domain of transport. Now, in his thought experiments, people are placed behind a veil of ignorance. These people have to set the rules of the game, to have to design a transportation system without knowing what their position will be in society when the veil of ignorance, as it's called, is lifted. So people think about the design of transport system and thereby about the pattern of accessibility without knowing where they will end up in society, what they will have, where they will live, if they will have children, and so on. Now, given this fundamental state of uncertainty for the fictive persons behind the veil of ignorance, they want to try and avoid certain risks. They want to avoid the brute bad luck of being stuck without sufficient accessibility. They want to avoid being stuck without transport. And they can do so in the thought experiment by purchasing insurance schemes. Now, they can purchase insurance schemes for different kind of risk. And I distinguish in my book between three forms of risk. One is travel-related impairments. So the persons behind the veil of ignorance might not be sure whether they will be have some limitations in traveling around or not. And another risk they may have is that they'll have low income. Low income that maybe not will allow them to purchase a vehicle, to purchase expensive train tickets. That will limit their ability to purchase all kind of means of transportation. And a third risk is that they might end up in a location that they didn't plan to live in. That they ended up for all kind of reasons, not by their choosing. Now, what the persons can do is, in the thought experiment, they can purchase insurances. And with these insurances, they actually protect themselves against these risks. They avoid that one of these risks translates into the bad luck of not being able to get to the places they want to get to. Now, I can say a lot more about these insurance schemes, and in the book I do so elaborately and in detail. But most important, I think, is to capture the basic bottom line of this thought experiment. And that bottom line can be captured actually in one sentence. And that sentence is that a transportation system is a system that provides sufficient accessibility to virtually all. That means the people behind the veil of ignorance, not knowing where they will live, where they will be in society, will design a transport system and related insurance schemes that will guarantee them always, no matter how unlucky they are, will guarantee always a sufficient level of accessibility. Now, there are three components to this principle of justice. One is fairness requires that everybody should be provided with sufficient accessibility. Second, there are some exceptions to this rule. Now, these exceptions are related to the fact that maybe in some cases we cannot provide sufficient accessibility, and in other cases that it might be too expensive to provide it. And third, and very fundamental, is the fact that a thought experiment can only define a principle of justice. So my thought experiment leads me to the identification of the sufficiency principle. And it's a principle that I didn't invent myself. It has been supported by, in a more general sense, by many social justice theories. But what is important to highlight is that a systematic thought experiment can never deliver an exact number or an exact value of what a sufficient accessibility level is. The thought experiment can only define a principle, and then giving a practical translation to that principle is beyond systematic reasoning, beyond philosophy. It is in a fundamental sense a matter of societal debate and political decision making. Now, this principle, as I have formulated it here, is in a way formulated as a transportation engineer, as a transportation planner. It is formulated from the perspective of transport system. But you can also translate the same principle from the perspective of the person, which would be more meaningful if you talk about justice. And in that case, the principle reads, virtually every person is entitled to a sufficient level of accessibility. Now, this is a simple principle, I think, and it seems also a very intuitively appealing principle. And that's what I meant in the beginning when I said that what I'm going to say is rather obvious, maybe. But if you start thinking about the principle and what it means, the consequences are very radical. Now, if you accept the claim that each person is entitled to a sufficient level of accessibility, transportation planning is no longer about simply addressing this congestion, which is at the center of debates in virtually all countries. The question is not whether these people stuck in traffic are losing time, as annoying as that may be. The question is whether these people, given the fact that they have a car, and given the fact that the road system is not functioning as optimized as we maybe would like to, whether they can still have access to a broad range of activities, whether they still have sufficient accessibility. That should be the question, and not whether they are losing time. Now, the same question can be asked for these people getting on and off the bus. Do they experience a sufficient level of accessibility? Do they, given the fact that maybe they don't have a car, and given the public transport system as it is provided to them through public transport services, maybe demand responsive transport services, whether those services provide them with a sufficient level of accessibility? That is the question that should be asked, not whether these people are losing time being stuck in traffic in the bus or waiting for the bus itself. It is about whether the system provides them with sufficient accessibility. Now, this people-centered perspective, as I call it, implies a radically different approach to transportation planning. It implies, as I think you already understood, that we should move away from congestion towards measuring and analyzing the patterns of accessibility and inaccessibility as they emerge because of the function of the transport system and the land use system together. And so what is more, we should not only analyze these general patterns of accessibility and inaccessibility, but especially we should be interested in identifying the persons that do not receive enough accessibility, actually are below what is called a sufficiency threshold. Now, in my book, I analyze the patterns of accessibility for the Amsterdam region. And starting from a people-centered perspective, I measure accessibility as it is experienced by all kinds of population groups. And it's in a way a very simple exercise, and I do nothing new there. It can be done based on data that are typically collected as part of the process of transport planning. And it can be done in most cities around the world with data that are readily available. What I've done, and what I think maybe is somewhat new, is plotting these people in a graph. In a very simple graph. Let me present that graph to you. So what I do in the graph, I understand you can't hear me well. I see a message now. Apologies for this. I hope this is better. I'm now a little bit closer to the screen and to my microphone. Now the graph looks as follows. On the x-axis is the speed with which people can travel to all neighborhoods in their vicinity, around them. It is in a way a measure of the ease of movement. So it's not only where you travel today, but whether you can also travel easily to all kinds of other places. So ease of movement is on the x-axis. On the y-axis, there's accessibility. And accessibility can be measured in many ways. And for the purpose of my case study in Amsterdam, I've measured accessibility in terms of the number of jobs you can reach within 30 minutes. Now, what I've subsequently done is place population groups in this graph. I've done this so by distinguishing between groups based on two characteristics. First, I identify persons by the place, the neighborhood I live in, assuming that roughly a neighborhood provides a certain level of accessibility, and that neighborhoods differ from each other. And second, I analyze whether people, or I distinguish people whether they have a car or not, assuming that the car provides in many cases a benefit, gives additional accessibility. And so based on this simple distinction, I have plotted all population groups in this graph. And the result looks as follows. Every dot in the graph represents a population group as living in a particular neighborhood in the region of Amsterdam, and whether having access or not access to a car. And it also makes a distinction between the situation of those groups in peak hours and during off-peak hours. Now, this group of people, this group of dots, represents the people that have access to a car and their level of accessibility during off-peak hours. Now, it's clear that these people during off-peak hours have quite a high level of accessibility and a high ease of movement. The same groups of people are represented here during rush hour. And as may be expected, their ease of movement goes down and also their accessibility level accordingly. And these are the population groups living in those same neighborhoods who don't have access to a car. As may be expected, their ease of movement and their level of accessibility is substantially lower than that experienced by car owners, whether they are in or outside rush hour. A pattern of accessibility, I think, which is rather typical for cities in the developed world, except for those cities with maybe a very well-developed public transport system. And certainly Amsterdam doesn't have the poorest system around the world. What is important is that if you accept the sufficiency principle, which I have presented before, so if you accept that every person is entitled to a minimum level of accessibility, then what policymaking requires is setting a sufficiency threshold, defining a level of accessibility which is sufficient and below which people are not served well enough. And obviously, this setting of the threshold is a translation of the sufficiency principle, a practical translation, which is something that should be done through democratic decision making. So it can be set anywhere. It can be set very low, it can be slightly higher, or even higher. And clearly, as we move up the sufficiency threshold, more and more population groups fall below the sufficiency threshold. What is even more important is that by setting the sufficiency threshold, we're actually defining two domains. We're defining a domain of sufficiency and a domain of insufficiency. And so below the threshold is a domain of insufficiency. That's the domain where population groups are positioned who don't experience a good enough quality of transportation to provide them with a sufficient level of accessibility. They lack access to the destination they want to travel to. Maybe they're managing now, but if their situation changes over time, they might have difficulty finding a job, finding another doctor, maybe starting a new study, or maybe just meeting family and friends. The other way around, obviously above the threshold, is the domain of sufficiency. These people are well off. They can reach the places they want to get to, and if their situation changes, they still have multiple choices. And since the sufficiency threshold has been defined politically, we think they are sufficiently well off. Now, the delineation of these two domains is very fundamental. It seems very obvious, but it has radical consequences. So stay with me as I try to explain them. Because the argument I've briefly explained of the people sitting behind the veil of ignorance purchasing insurance schemes to protect them against forms of inaccessibility actually translates into the duties we have vis-à-vis the persons in both domains. So when the people who find themselves in the domain of efficiency do not have a claim on each other. They are actually well off, and if they would sit behind the veil of ignorance and realize they would be well off, they wouldn't purchase any insurance to protect themselves against the situation. They would accept the situation as is, without actually setting aside some of their resources to protect themselves against this risk. So they are not entitled to any payments or any support from the insurance scheme that is set up behind the veil of ignorance. They are well off. Governments do not have to intervene. More important, or more radical, is that this implies that actually the transport system doesn't have to be improved at all. So even for people in congestion, getting frustrated about travel time losses, if that congestion doesn't affect their accessibility to such an extent that they are below the sufficiency threshold, they have no claim on government intervention. We can improve the situation, but only if they can fully finance those interventions. There shouldn't be any cross-subsidy, because a prudent person behind the veil of ignorance would not have purchased such an insurance scheme. And I hope you're following my argument. Now the same argument about insurance schemes holds the other way around in the domain of efficiency. In that domain, we do owe something to each other. We are indeed required to assist each other. In that domain, the prudent persons behind the veil of ignorance would have purchased insurance. They would have put some resources aside to help them get out of that situation, to bring them above the sufficiency threshold. And that help, that assistance, that insurance scheme is actually an obligation that we have vis-à-vis each other. And governments who are there to protect us against forms of bad luck, governments are the practical vehicle of creating that insurance scheme, of protecting us against this form of brute bad luck that we are below the sufficiency threshold. And so below the threshold of insufficiency, we have a duty to help each other. And practically speaking, governments have a duty to intervene. Governments actually should improve the situation of those people. And what is just as important, these interventions may be subsidized, because the insurance schemes generate money to create these improvements. So what we can do in the domain of insufficiency is use funds that are created by what I call an accessibility insurance scheme to improve the situation of people below the sufficiency threshold. So improvements are not only warranted here, but they are obligatory. Now let me end, and then give you room for questions, with 3 rules of what I call people-centered transportation planning. Because my book is titled Transport Justice, but it actually lays out a new approach to transportation planning. And so let me end with the 3 basic rules of that approach to transport planning. So the first rule is this: I shall not, and I exaggerate here, analyze the state of the transport system. You should not focus on the transport system as we can do now. We tend to analyze the system is working. Instead, we should analyze the situation of people. We should start from the people and not from the system. We should analyze how the system is serving the people. Only if we start from the situation of all people, we will also make sure that transport planning will cater for all people. If we start from the system, we will never achieve that goal. We will always ignore people who do not use the system or are hardly visible in that system. That's the first rule. And so the graph I presented for Amsterdam is in a way the first step of this rule, the practical step. Now the second rule is as follows: do not assess transport interventions based on their efficiency, as we do now, increasingly around the world, using cost-benefit analysis to assess whether an intervention is justified or not. We should not do this, because transport is not about being efficient. Transport is basically about creating a system that serves all people. And so what we should do is analyze whether the transport system is serving all people, and whether new interventions help those people who need it most, whether these interventions are effective in bringing people above the sufficiency threshold. So that should be the focus of our assessment, not cost-benefit analysis, but probably some form of cost-effectiveness analysis. And accepting that maybe some projects cost more than they, in economic sense, generate. Now, the third and final rule of people-centered transportation planning is very radical and beyond the scope of a transportation planner, because it requires a fundamentally different approach to how we finance transport. So we should no longer finance our transport systems through car-based forms of taxation, which we do in many countries around the world. We use road taxes, we use gasoline taxes, to finance not only road infrastructure, but also to finance our public transport services, our bicycle lanes, and so forth. And by doing this, we always create a very tense and difficult debate about where the funds should go to. They are generated by car drivers, but we use them for something else. Is this justified? Well, we actually should cut the relationship between taxation for mobility and using the car. We should create an income-based accessibility insurance scheme. That insurance scheme reflects my thought experiment, which I discussed briefly earlier in the lecture. And it creates a pool of money or funds which can be invested to actually bring people above the sufficiency threshold. We do not have to justify this anymore because they are intended for that. They are meant to actually create a transport system that is fair for all, that serves all people. Now, I do realize that these rules may sound radical to many people listening now, and certainly to people who are not listening, who are less open to ideas of justice. But I think that if you want to create transport systems that serve us all, and I think we should, so if you want to create transport systems that enable everybody to enjoy the fruits of living together, then we have no option, no choice, but to radically change our perspective. We have to move from transport planning, focusing on the transport system, to a people-centered form of transportation planning. So I hope that I have given you some insights into my line of reasoning on justice, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Michael, are you taking over? Should I start with answering the first question? Okay, so the question asked is, and I read the question out. You speak mainly of urban dwellers who might find themselves below the sufficiency threshold. You mentioned bad luck as a cause. What about those who choose, under a certain degree of constraint, to live in suburban or even rural areas? Some may not necessarily be the poorest. It's an excellent question, and it's something I've grappled with in my book extensively. And it's basically a classic question in philosophy of social justice about responsibility and whether we can actually hold people responsible for their choices. Now, I think we have to take into account and understand that transport systems are provided to collectives. So we provide infrastructures and services not specially for you or for her or for the neighbor, but actually a whole collective of people is benefiting from it. That's one issue. The other issue is that it is very difficult for governments to determine whether somebody is responsible for his choices, whether somebody is living in a suburb because of choice or because he's being priced out of the urban core, because there's gentrification going on. It is very difficult even for an employer to determine whether an employee is not functioning well because of a situation or because of a lack of competence. And so an employer who knows his employee has already difficulty to ascribe responsibility, let alone a government who's very far away from the people to determine who is responsible. So although responsibility plays a role, and I think we should create incentives that stimulate people to make responsible choices, I think we should realize that in many cases people end up in rural areas, in suburban areas, simply because it happened, not because they really chose this, not maybe also because they thought about the consequences in the long term. People who are not behind the veil of ignorance, who are not in a thought experiment, are not so prudent. People make mistakes, and I think we should be forgiving about making mistakes. It doesn't mean that everybody should get the same level of accessibility, but I think we should also address the plight of people who move to the suburbs or live in rural areas. For those people who have grown up maybe in suburban areas, also realize that they build up their entire life there. Their family might be there, they're attached to that place. And so they cannot also be held responsible for their choice to stay in that place and to stay where they feel at home. They were simply born there and they like to be where they were born. So I think the issue of responsibility is philosophically very interesting, but practically, I don't think it should be playing such an important role in transport planning. We should only make sure we have incentives that avoid these choices. So we should actually, indeed, make people pay for their transport choices as long as they can pay for it. So subsidizing people in the suburbs, I would not be in favor. I would accept subsidizing people on low incomes in the suburbs, but well-to-do people who can afford the high cost of living there, of the infrastructure that we have to provide to them, they should pay the full cost. And that way you create an incentive to make wise choices as much as possible. I have another question here. I hope this answered the first question to some extent. And the second question is, how will an insurance scheme work and how does that factor into land use issues? So I think I've addressed some of that. So in an insurance scheme, in a way, I do realize that the risk you have of having a low level of accessibility is not the same as the risk of falling ill. So where most countries have some kind of health care insurance scheme, which tends to be public, obligatory, subsidized, partly for low-income people. It seems different and it feels different in the domain of mobility. But if you realize that clearly some of the risks we run are not chosen, then it does make sense to talk of a risk. So people typically don't choose low income. And people don't choose their set of abilities, which often explain a low income. And I would argue that the low income is not a matter of choice, although I do realize there are different perspectives on this. But I don't think they hold if you would scrutinize them with a philosophy of justice. So living in a particular area is a kind of a risk, as I tried to explain, because you are born somewhere, you like to stay there. So it's a risk. You don't know whether you will be born in a rural area with low accessibility or not. And you also don't know whether you will be facing travel-related impairments for sure. So clearly, this idea of an insurance makes sense if you look at it from a distance, and basically would mean that people would pay a share of their income, which would go into a general pool, which would then be used to push people above the sufficiency threshold. And so obviously, and maybe people may think, so this would draw lots of funds to rural areas where accessibility level is low, but this is not the case, and for two reasons. So one reason is that low accessibility in rural areas is not caused by poor transport. Most people living in rural areas with a car still experience low levels of accessibility. And this situation can hardly be corrected by providing a better transport system. typically the transport system is quite well developed, the roads are functioning well, the network is rather dense, and there's hardly any congestion. Their low level of accessibility is not caused by transport, and so another type of intervention is necessary. So that's one reason why the focus, justice doesn't lead to a focus on rural areas. The second is that even though that there might be some people, and there certainly are people in rural areas who are below the sufficiency threshold because of poor transport system, there are many more people in the same situation living in the urban fringe and in large suburban areas. So if you would take into account the number of people affected by a poor level of accessibility and their level of accessibility, then you realize that actually the focus should be much more on the urban fringe and on large suburban areas which are poorly connected to the public transport system. So the approach is not about providing a simple bus service to every little town, but actually providing a fundamentally well-functioning and high-quality public transport system on the city's edges and to suburbs, which we have not done over the past decades. We have connected them well to a road system, and we have upgraded that road system, but we have neglected public transport. Let me go over some more questions. Just a minute. I have to read them. I was hoping Michael could do this, but Michael has trouble with his microphone, he informed me.
I think I might have solved it now. Can you
Yes.
hear me? Okay, great. Okay.
That's great.
So I'll go ahead and read the next questions. We have time for a few more. We have a question from Brazil. How do you design an income-based access insurance scheme in cities where poor people live in neighborhoods close to rich people? That is technically the same physical access to transit, like in Rio de Janeiro, the urban slums, the favelas. Does the accessibility for these poor communities have to consider the ability to pay fares, etc., in a way they wouldn't be included in the same accessibility level than the rich community nearby?
Okay, complex question. I think I understand. So one observation is, or one result from my thought experiment, which I didn't expect, is that actually everybody should pay as much as possible for their own transport costs. Obviously, the moment your income levels get too low, you can't do that anymore. You cannot purchase a sufficient level of accessibility anymore, simply because your income is too low. So you either use the income to purchase accessibility, and then you will have poverty in other domains, maybe in food, maybe in housing, maybe in healthcare, or you give up accessibility, and then you have enough food and healthcare and so on. So in terms of the reception of support, in the ideal case, obviously there are practical problems, but in the ideal case, fares would be differentiated according to income levels. So people with a low income level would actually get a subsidized fare, so they can use the public transport system the same way as the rich community can. So that's from the perspective of the recipients of subsidy. So subsidy only goes to people who really need it. So we don't subsidize public transport anymore across the board, at least not for reasons of justice. We might want to subsidize it for reasons of environment, to attract richer people to the public transport system. That's a different motivation. And I don't say necessarily a bad motivation, but it's a different motivation. So that's aside from the recipients. We should subsidize people on low income so they can travel on public transport, and it might even in some cases be we should subsidize car ownership, where that would be the most efficient solution, so sometimes in rural areas. And on the side of how do we generate the funds, well, income-based insurance scheme basically means an income-based additional tax. So like in some countries where we have a healthcare tax which is income related, so we would have a mobility related income tax. Now obviously this requires a developed income taxation system, which might not be available in all countries around the world, and so this means the funds have to come from somewhere else. But the idea of earmarking transportation funds for everybody rather than for those who generate it, so even if you would still say, okay, let's generate the funds for car owners as a practical strategy that works well because we don't have a well-functioning income taxation system, I would say earmark this not as a car tax, but earmark it as a mobility tax, which is dedicated for everybody. and which can be used for everybody, is not meant to finance and subsidize car drivers. I hope this answered the question.
Okay, next question. As regulations are tending to become decentralized, have you considered this fact in your reasoning of accessibility?
Okay, interesting question. I would say my approach is particularly suited to address the regional level. So that is some level of decentralization, but maybe the person asking the question has more decentralization in mind. So I think for a proper transportation system, you have to organize at a regional level at which most activities take place, where there's lots of cross-border mobility. I would agree that it's rather difficult to set up an income-based taxation. You could imagine some kind of value-added tax like is done in the US, but it's rather a regressive system, or you could imagine a kind of a progressive system on real estate values that could generate the same income for actually setting up an insurance scheme on a regional level. I could imagine, I'm fully aware that my proposals are very sensitive politically. It won't be accepted very easily, but that's not the intention of academic work. Is not to propose something which can be implemented necessarily easily. It's intended, I think, to define a clear benchmark. In the ideal world, I think this is how we should finance mobility. This is what finance should be used for. And then we can, of course, deviate from this ideal for all kinds of practical reasons, political prudence being one of them.
Okay, we have another question from somebody in the US related to how affordability integrates with accessibility. And you had suggested subsidizing transit fares, but this question brings up the point that fares are increasing rapidly and transit, in fact, is not subsidized like housing and food. So in the circumstances where it is not subsidized, what do you do?
Funny, in my book I do the opposite, because my thought experiment assumes that everybody has a fair income level. So there might be income inequalities, but even if you're at the bottom, it's still a fair income. And a fair income implies that you can purchase a sufficient set of products you need to live from, so food, healthcare, including mobility. And in the case there's not enough income, actually the solution is actually to subsidize transport. So you kind of do income policy via transport in a way. So you're suggesting the other way around. You cannot subsidize public transport. Well, maybe one of the reasons that public transport is not subsidized is because it's really a very blunt instrument. If you subsidize public transport, you're subsidizing actually many people who can just afford it the full price. And it's really a good question why you should do so. So one solution would be to really earmark subsidies to link it to people's income status, even though that has drawbacks too. The other option is to call for a better income distribution. There is no magic wand here. There's no magic wand. So if there's no willingness to subsidize public transport, the only thing you can do is develop arguments, and that's the rational side of promoting change and organizing people, organizing organizations to push for change. And there's the organizational side of change, the power side, if you like. There's no magic wand, so there's no willingness to do anything, and we have to push for change. I don't see how I can answer the question otherwise.
Okay, one last question related to African cities and whether you considered or adjusted your sufficiency threshold according to different regional contexts.
Okay, good question. Yes, I do. The sufficiency threshold, I think, should not be general for several reasons. One is because measuring accessibility is very complex. And so what I've done is adding up jobs, and clearly one region has much more jobs than the other. And so it doesn't make sense to take the sufficiency threshold in New York and transpose it to a much smaller city with much less jobs. I also think that maybe jobs might not be the best measure of accessibility in an African context. I'm less familiar with the situation, but I could imagine using a percentage of the urban area that can be reached as a more proper indicator, maybe weighted by whether it's close to the center or not. Because jobs are less formalized or more informal. I would define the sufficiency threshold. The principle is general, and the threshold is something political. So that's the other reason why there could be differences between cities. So no, it's not like we can sit in the Netherlands or Israel and define a sufficiency threshold and say, that's what you should apply in Dar es Salaam. No, definitely not. You have to look at the local situation, understand the local situation, understand how you should measure accessibility, and then define something which makes sense, which addresses the problem of people that experience accessibility problems. So there should be clearly a link between how you measure accessibility, how you define the sufficiency threshold, and the situation of people.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. I want to thank Carol for his presentation, and there will be a poll at the end asking you about the webinar, and if you have any follow-up questions, we will collect the remaining questions and try to answer them via email. And if you have any further questions, please follow up after you get a prompt thanking you for joining the webinar. So with that, we conclude the webinar, and if you have any other suggestions for thinkers or speakers on transport justice and inclusiveness, please write to us as well. This is a topic that we will continue exploring through the next year. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you all for listening.